If you tried to list every German aircraft of World War II, you would quickly run out of breath. Fighters, bombers, dive bombers, night fighters, transports, gliders, jet planes, even rocket-powered interceptors. Some of these machines became legends. Others were more dangerous to their own pilots than to the enemy. And a few were so strange that they looked like science fiction sketches that somehow made it into real combat. At the start of the war, the Luftwaffe looked untouchable. Modern fighters, fast bombers, new tactics that smashed Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries in a matter of weeks. But as the war dragged on, the picture changed. Fuel shortages, bombed factories, growing swarms of Allied fighters, and a desperate search for miracle weapons. Germany pushed its aircraft designs further and further. Sometimes that produced brilliant machines. Sometimes it produced beautiful failures. In this video, we walk through the main German aircraft that actually mattered in World War II, what each of them was supposed to do, how they really performed in combat, and why some are still famous today, while others vanished into the footnotes. We start where the Luftwaffe's power truly lived and died, with its fighters and interceptors. If one aircraft symbolized German air power in World War II, it was the Messerschmitt Bf 109. From the invasion of Poland to the final days over a burning Berlin, this fighter was always there. Early versions were light, fast, and heavily armed for their time. Over Poland, Norway, and France, the Bf 109 carved out air superiority with brutal efficiency. During the Battle of Britain, it met the best the RAF could send, Spitfires and Hurricanes. For a time, the fight was close to even. Skill, tactics, and fuel decided as much as raw performance. As the war went on, the Bf 109 kept changing. More powerful engines, more armor, more guns. By the late years, it was flying with far more power than the original airframe had been built for. Pilots loved its climb rate and acceleration. They feared its narrow landing gear and unforgiving ground handling. Takeoffs and landings killed many rookies before they ever saw an enemy. The Bf 109 was never a perfect fighter, but it was built in vast numbers, fought on every front, and carried the Luftwaffe from its first victories to its final collapse. If you picture a German fighter in World War II, you are probably seeing this one. If the Bf 109 was a rapier, the Focke-Wulf FW 190 was a sledgehammer. When it first appeared over the channel in 1941, Allied pilots were stunned. Here was a German fighter that climbed hard, rolled fast, and hit like a truck. For a while, it outclassed almost everything the RAF could field. The FW 190 used a tough radial engine and a strong, wide-track undercarriage. It was rugged, forgiving, and stable as a gun platform. It could carry heavy armament, multiple cannons, machine guns, bombs, and later even rockets. It served as a pure fighter, then as a fighter-bomber, then as a low-level ground attack aircraft ripping up tanks, trucks, and trains close to the front. The Allies were forced to upgrade their own designs just to keep up. Improved Spitfires, new American fighters, and better tactics slowly narrowed the gap. The Fu-190 never fully replaced the Bf 109, but it gave the Luftwaffe something it desperately needed, a second powerful, highly adaptable fighter family that could take punishment and keep fighting. The Bf 110 was supposed to be the future of air combat, a long-range twin-engine destroyer that could escort bombers, shoot down enemy fighters, and still carry bombs itself. In the early campaigns against weak opposition, the idea seemed to work. Over Poland and France, the Bf 110 scored kills and looked impressive in propaganda. Then came the Battle of Britain. Against fast, agile, single-engine fighters, the dream collapsed. The Bf 110 was too big, too heavy, and too slow in a turn. Once it lost its own escort of Bf 109s, Spitfires and Hurricanes tore into it. As a daylight escort fighter, the Zerstörer concept died in the skies over southern England. But the Bf 110 was not finished. At night, against bomber streams, its weaknesses mattered less. It had room for radar equipment, extra fuel, and heavy guns. Converted into a night fighter, the Bf 110 found a new role. Guided by ground radar and airborne sets, it slipped into bomber formations in the dark and attacked from above, below, or behind. In daylight, it had failed. In darkness, it became one of Germany's most important tools for fighting the Allied bombing campaign. The Junkers Ju-88 began as a fast medium bomber, but the basic airframe was so flexible that it was adapted into almost everything: bomber, dive bomber, reconnaissance aircraft, and night fighter. As British and American bombers started hitting German cities night after night, the Luftwaffe needed more night fighters. The Ju-88 was a natural candidate. It had space for radar, extra crew, and heavy armament. Night fighter versions of the Ju-88 carried radar antennas on the nose and wings. Inside, operators watched glowing screens while the pilot flew mostly blind, guided toward the bomber stream. Once close, the Ju-88 used powerful cannon, often including upward-firing guns aimed at the bellies of bombers. Attacks came from below, from the side, from angles that were hard for gunners to cover. These aircraft were not glamorous. They did not dogfight. They did not dive toward tanks. But for much of the war, Ju-88 night fighters were a core part of Germany's air defense against Allied bombers. The Me-410 was meant to fix the problems of the Bf-110. More power, more speed, more bite against heavily defended bomber formations. With its sleek nose and strong engines, the Me-410 was fast in a straight line. It could be armed with heavy cannon, including weapons designed specifically to punch holes in bombers. Remote-controlled guns in the rear added some protection against attacks from behind. On paper, it looked like the ideal bomber destroyer. Slash through the formation, fire a devastating burst, break away before the escorts could catch up. In reality, the Allies were no longer flying unescorted. Single-engine fighters roamed around and above the bomber streams. When they caught a big twin like the Me-410, the results were often ugly. The Me-410 did score successes. It shot down bombers, it frightened crews, but it never existed in the numbers or in the conditions needed to change the course of the air war. Like the Bf-110 before it, it was squeezed between stronger bombers and ever more numerous escorts. If any German aircraft looked like it had been dropped into 1940 skies from the future, it was the Me-262. This twin-engine jet fighter was far faster than the piston-engined aircraft around it. In level flight, Allied fighters struggled to even close the distance. A clean Me-262 could simply light its engines and leave almost anything behind. Armed with heavy 30mm cannon and sometimes rockets, it could shred bomber formations in seconds. One pass through a tight box of bombers could leave burning aircraft falling out of the sky. But the Me-262 carried a heavy price tag. Its jet engines were fragile, short-lived, and sensitive to poor fuel. Takeoffs and landings were risky. Maintenance demands were high, and trained ground crews were in short supply. The Luftwaffe also argued about how to use it. Fighter, bomber, interceptor, precious time and resources were lost in the debate. In the hands of experienced pilots, the Me-262 was terrifying. As a miracle weapon that might turn the war around, it came too late, in too few numbers, with too little fuel and training behind it. If the Me-262 looked futuristic, the Me-163 Comet looked outright insane. This tiny rocket-powered interceptor climbed like a missile. Launched from a short runway, it shot upward almost vertically, racing toward the bomber stream at incredible speed. For a brief window at the top of its climb, the Comet was deadly. It flashed past bomber formations so quickly that gunners had only a moment to react. A well-aimed burst from its cannon could be devastating, but almost everything about the Comet was dangerous. Its rocket fuel was highly volatile and corrosive. Accidents on the ground could kill or maim crews in horrible ways. In the air, once the fuel ran out, the pilot had to glide back to a risky landing in a stubby little machine with no power. The Me-163 was a weapon born out of desperation. It scored some kills. It terrified bomber crews who saw it streak past. But the price in accidents, the tiny numbers built, and the limited combat impact meant it was more a symbol of how desperate Germany had become than a serious solution to the bombing campaign. In the chaotic last months of the war, Germany tried one more jet fighter, the He-162, the so-called Volksjäger, or People's Fighter. On paper, it was a simple idea. Build a small jet from cheap materials, mostly wood, mount the engine on top of the fuselage, train new pilots quickly, and throw them into the defense of the Reich. Reality was harsher. The He-162 was fast and agile, but also twitchy and unforgiving. Its light wooden structure was built under terrible late-war conditions. Structural failures and technical problems were common. The aircraft demanded a skilled pilot, not a half-trained teenager, yet that was exactly who it was meant for. A few units flew the He-162 in combat. They scored very few kills and lost aircraft to accidents and overwhelming Allied opposition. The People's Fighter never became the mass weapon its name promised. Instead, it stands as a compact symbol of the final phase of the Luftwaffe. Brilliant engineering ideas rushed into service far too late, with no realistic chance of changing the outcome. Few aircraft look as instantly recognizable as the Ju-87 Stuka. Bent gull wings, fixed landing gear with bulky fairings, a siren that screamed as it dived toward its target. In the early war, the Stuka was terrifying. Over Poland, the Low Countries, and France, it struck bridges, columns, and forts with frightening precision. Ground units saw it as a symbol of German air power. But the Stuka had a weakness that could not be hidden forever. It was slow, very slow. Once enemy fighters appeared in numbers, the Ju-87 became easy prey. During the Battle of Britain, Stukas were shot down in large quantities. Without air superiority, they simply could not survive in daylight. Still, the Ju-87 did not disappear. It found new roles on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean. Later versions carried heavier guns and bombs, hunting tanks and ships at low level. By the end of the war, the Stuka was outdated. But as a psychological weapon and a symbol of early Blitzkrieg, it left a mark that still echoes in history. If one bomber represents the Luftwaffe's early war campaigns, it is the Heinkel He-111. With its glazed nose and oval engines, it became a familiar sight over Spain, Poland, Norway, France, and Britain. It was originally designed as a fast commercial transport, then adapted into a medium bomber. Early on, its speed gave it some protection, but as enemy fighters improved, the He-111 became more and more vulnerable. Defensive guns and armor were added, but the basic airframe could not keep up with the changing air war. The He-111 flew in almost every major theater where Germany operated bombers. It carried bombs, torpedoes, and occasionally even guided weapons. It hauled supplies to Stalingrad and other trapped garrisons, often under heavy fire. Crews respected its toughness. Many also knew they were flying a design that was past its prime. By late war, the He-111 was no longer a modern frontline bomber, but it remained in service simply because Germany had few replacements left. It stayed in the sky until there was almost nowhere left to fly. The Dornier Do-17 earned the nickname the Flying Pencil because of its slim, narrow fuselage. It was a fast, light bomber early in the war. Over Poland, Norway, and France, its speed and agility made it harder to intercept than heavier machines. In the Battle of Britain, that advantage shrank. Faster enemy fighters and tighter defenses cut into its survivability. Range and bomb load were also limited. To answer this, Germany introduced the larger Do-217. This was a bulked-up, more capable bomber and attack aircraft. It carried heavier loads, flew longer distances, and could be adapted for many special roles. Some Do-217s launched guided bombs and anti-ship weapons, striking at Allied ships from a distance. Others served in night operations. The Dornier bombers were never as famous as the He-111 or Ju-88, but they filled important niches, especially in anti-shipping and special attack roles where their flexibility mattered. If there was a true workhorse bomber in the Luftwaffe, it was the Junkers Ju-88. Originally sold as a fast bomber, it turned into one of the most versatile aircraft of the war. Medium bomber, dive bomber, torpedo bomber, reconnaissance aircraft, night fighter, you name it, the Ju-88 probably did it. As a bomber, it combined decent speed, reasonable bomb load, and a strong structure. It could be pushed into steep dives against ships and fortified positions. It served over Norway, in the Battle of Britain, in Russia, in North Africa, and over the Mediterranean. No single version was perfect. Defensive armament was never truly strong. And like all German bombers, it became more vulnerable as Allied fighters and radar-controlled defenses improved. But the Ju-88's ability to adapt kept it in service from the first days of the war to the last. Few aircraft families in the Luftwaffe were as widespread or as important. The FW-200 Condor started life as a civilian airliner, luxury seats, long-range flights. Then war came, and it was handed to the Luftwaffe. As a long-range maritime patrol and anti-shipping aircraft, the Condor suddenly mattered a great deal. From distant bases, it could range far out into the Atlantic, spotting convoys and radioing their positions to U-boats. It could also attack ships directly with bombs. For a time, Winston Churchill called it the scourge of the Atlantic. But the FW-200 was not designed for hard military service. Its airframe suffered from structural weakness when heavily loaded and flown in rough conditions. As Allied fighter cover extended further out to sea, the Condor's vulnerability grew. Still, in the critical early years of the Battle of the Atlantic, its eyes helped guide submarines to their prey. It was never a perfect weapon, but for a while, it was a dangerous one. If there was one German aircraft built almost purely to kill tanks, it was the Henschel Hs-129. This squat, heavily armored twin-engined attack aircraft had a tiny armored cockpit buried deep in the fuselage. The pilot sat inside a metal shell, protected from ground fire. Underneath, the Hs-129 carried cannons, bombs, and later very heavy anti-tank guns. On the Eastern Front, it hunted Soviet armor at low level, diving in on columns and firing into engine decks and turrets. The aircraft was tough, but difficult to fly. Visibility was poor, power was limited. The engines were under strong load in combat. It never existed in huge numbers, and it faced stronger and stronger enemy fighters as the war went on. Even so, the Hs-129 showed how far Germany was willing to go in the search for a dedicated tank killer, a flying gun barrel wrapped in armor, built to survive a very deadly job. As the war dragged on, more and more FW-190s were pulled down from the heights of fighter combat and pushed into the dirt of ground attack. Fitted with bombs, rockets, and extra armor, these FW-190 fighter bombers, the Jabos, became brutal tools of close support. They smashed troop concentrations, artillery positions, trucks, and even tanks. On the Eastern Front, they made fast, low-level runs against Soviet lines. In the West, they attacked beaches, bridges, and advancing Allied columns. The FW-190's strong airframe and powerful engine made it well-suited to this role. It could dive hard, deliver its weapons, and pull away quickly. But every meter flown at low level brought it closer to anti-aircraft guns, small arms fire, and the ever-growing presence of Allied fighters. In this role, the FW-190 traded altitude and air superiority for mud, smoke, and tree lines. It did not always survive the trade, but when it did, it could be devastating. Not every important aircraft carries bombs or guns. Some carry the war itself. The Junkers Ju-52, nicknamed Tante Ju or Auntie Ju, was the Luftwaffe's flying truck. 3 engines, corrugated metal skin, steady, almost old-fashioned lines. It carried paratroopers into action in early airborne operations. It hauled troops, fuel, and ammunition to front lines and remote airfields. It evacuated wounded and flew supplies into surrounded pockets. In Norway, in the Low Countries, in Greece, in North Africa, and on the Eastern Front, the Ju-52 worked endlessly. Stalingrad is one of the most famous examples where Ju-52 crews flew into a cauldron of fire, trying to keep an encircled army alive. The aircraft was slow and poorly armed. As enemy fighters and flak intensified, losses mounted. But the Ju-52 kept flying because it had to. Without transports like this, many German campaigns would have collapsed much earlier. If the Ju-52 was the flying truck, the Me-323 Gigant was the flying warehouse. This enormous 6-engine transport was developed from a large military glider. It could carry trucks, guns, fuel, and large numbers of troops. A ramp in the nose allowed vehicles to drive straight in and out. On paper, its capacity was impressive. In reality, the Gigant was slow, huge, and hard to protect. It needed long runways and good weather. Once in the air, it was an easy target for fighters. Convoys of Me-323s flying to North Africa, loaded with vital supplies, became prime targets. When Allied fighters caught them, the results were usually catastrophic. The Me-323 showed both the ambition and the limits of German airlift. It could move a lot in one go, but in a sky increasingly ruled by the enemy, that just made it a bigger, slower victim. Alongside transports, Germany made heavy use of military gliders. The DFS-230 was the most famous, a small assault glider that could carry a squad of troops and a few light weapons. Silent, cheap, and disposable, DFS-230s were used in some of the most daring German operations of the early war. The assault on the Belgian fort of Eben Emael, mountain landings in the invasion of Crete, sudden drops of troops onto narrow landing zones where powered aircraft could not safely land. Larger gliders like the Go-242 carried heavier loads, vehicles, guns, supplies. They were towed into the air by transports, then released near the target. Once on the ground, gliders were vulnerable and could not take off again. They were single-use delivery systems. In the early years, they allowed surprise landings in places no one expected aircraft to appear. Later, as air superiority shifted, dragging slow gliders across hostile skies became far more risky. Even so, they played a key role in showing how airborne forces could change a battlefield in a single, sudden strike. From razor-sharp fighters to lumbering transports and wild experimental jets, the Luftwaffe's aircraft tell the story of Germany's war in the air. Early on, machines like the Bf-109, He-111, and Ju-87 helped deliver fast, brutal victories. They were modern, efficient, and perfectly matched to Blitzkrieg. As the war widened and dragged on, the balance shifted. Bombers like the He-111 and Du-17 aged badly. The Ju-88 and Fw-190 carried more and more of the load. Transports like the Ju-52 tried to hold collapsing fronts together with airlifted supplies. In the final years, jets and rockets arrived. Me-262, Me-163, He-162. On paper, they were a glimpse of the future. In reality, they were launched into a sky already dominated by Allied numbers, fuel, and industry. Some German aircraft were brilliant, some were flawed, and some were simply desperate. Together, they show a rise from sharp, confident innovation to frantic, last-ditch improvisation. The story of the Luftwaffe is not just about machines. It is about what happens when even the most advanced designs are asked to fight a war that has already been lost.